Good morning. I appreciate you being here very much. Appreciate your attendance, encouragement that it gives me, and I know everyone else that is here. I want to encourage you to go ahead and open your Bibles to First Timothy chapter 5, and we're going to begin by reading this passage together. 1 Timothy chapter 5. The premise behind this is it's in the context of, if you remember, the family of the crown, how we interact with one another, how we treat one another. The focus of this particular text is on widows, such an important part of any congregation. Let's give our attention beginning in verse 9. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, has devoted herself to every good work, but refused to enroll younger widows. For when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. I've got to be totally honest with you this morning. I'm usually totally honest, uh, but I don't even know why we say that. I don't know that I've ever done a lesson on widows specifically. We'll be here 10 years in July, and it's kind of shocking. And that's the beauty of walking through a Bible text, a biblical text or a book, is that it gives you opportunities to address things that you perhaps haven't done before or perhaps don't want to do but need to be done. And that's the case here with this. If there's a group of individuals that is more neglected than any other group in the church, I think widows would be right up there. Because and there's a multitude of reasons as to why, but widows and widowers. I think it's perhaps because they don't necessarily have the voice, the representation, if you will, that maybe they ought to, the attention that we need to give them. So this particular text, Paul addresses that. And as it correlates to us, hopefully we're going to see a lot of connections. Evidently, as you probably gathered from this text, there was some type of what we might call a program in the church that was specifically designed to take care of widows. Now, in the society that we live in, under the government that we live under, it's great. I don't want to degrade it at all. But the government has become so big that in many facets, it has taken away the power that the church could have to impact the world. For instance, Social Security, right? The Social Security check. Well, if you take that away, who is left to take care of those older folks? And we don't want to call them older, do we? The more mature folks. Well, that would be left to the church, right? To families. There would be that interdependence, or the widows and the orphans, those who don't necessarily have the family unit that many of us enjoy and are left alone. Well, the church would have to naturally step in, but because of the nature of our government, that's been in many cases that's been taken away. So transport yourself. I say all that to say transport yourself to a time and a place where that didn't exist, where there was no like social security, and we are totally dependent upon each other. Well, the church steps in. And what Paul addresses here is the qualifications for those who should be enrolled in this particular program and those who shouldn't be enrolled. And apparently, this was a big deal because of all the things that he addresses. This is one of those that certainly was important. So turn your attention, first of all, as Paul does, to those who are helped, to those who ought to be helped. And as you begin this text, again, we don't call someone old unless they're proud of their age. Because you get to a point where it's like, yeah, I'm 110. And you get proud of how old you are. But don't we can't call, so we're calling them mature, right? There's a maturity requirement. And here, the maturity requirement is at least 60 years of age. Now we're thinking, 60, that's a relatively young age, but not if you take away about 10 or 15 years of our life expectancy. 60 becomes much older, doesn't it? More mature, excuse me. Becomes more mature in that particular context. And for us, 60, those are young people and they get younger all the time. But the mature aspect is certainly a requirement because apparently you get to a certain age where you don't care necessarily, or at least you get smart enough to not want to be married to a man anymore. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about getting to that point where you've reached, I don't necessarily need a man in my life anymore. I'll be all right. That's who we're talking about, those who are mature. And he moves on from there and he says, she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband. So there's this moral aspect to it as well. So the mature aspect, the maturity aspect, and then there's the moral aspect. Now, what we are talking about, and I believe that in this context, it seems pretty obvious that we cannot mean that somebody can only be married one time. That if her husband dies and she is young enough that she doesn't need to, because Paul says he would wish that the younger widows would marry. Rather, we are talking about, I believe, talking about somebody that is only has one husband at a time. You remember Jesus in his conversation with this woman at the well. You remember what he says in John chapter 4. He said, go fetch your husband. And she says, I have no husband. Well, you're right. You've had 5 husbands, and the one that you have now is not your husband. The husband of one wife, the moral aspect of sexual fidelity to your spouse. Well, that certainly would come into play as it does here in verse 9. And then we move into verse 10 where we get almost a machine gun, if you will, effect of a lot of manifold deeds that are done, a multitude of deeds that are done. And I don't know if it was specifically set up this way, but as I'm reading it, it seems to imply that there's this progression from home outward. Read it and see if you can pick up on this. In having a reputation of good works, if she has, here we go, brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. So you begin with raising children, right? Raising up your children, caring for her children. And then you move from that, has shown hospitality. That's her home, that's her domain. So you move from her immediate family, like her brood, if you will. And then you go to her house, her domain. And from there, we go to the saints, to her spiritual domain, having washed the feet of the saints. Now, I've never walked into a church building and my feet have been washed. We're living in a different time. Understand the cultural aspect. We don't walk everywhere we go. Our feet don't get as dirty as they used to. And it's not necessarily a custom for us to walk around the house barefoot or the church building barefoot. We're talking about displaying an attitude and action of humility and servitude and taking care of other people instead of herself. Second is her. First are others. Wash the feet of the saints, cared for the afflicted. And then this broad um, phrase has devoted herself to every good work. If there's something that was good that needed to be done, she was there. This is the woman that is to be enrolled. You've got this maturity. She's over 60. She's the wife of one. She's a one woman, one man type of woman. And then she is just full of good works. That might remind you of several people throughout the Bible, but the first one that comes to my mind is Dorcas, right? This Tabitha, she was just a woman that devoted herself to good things. And they brought, as she passed away, they brought all the things that she had made them, all the things that she had done for them. Somebody who had devoted herself to good works. Now turn your attention, that's verse 9 and 10. And as we approach verse 11, we begin with those who ought not to be enrolled, those who should be refused in their enrollment of this particular program, if you will. And it's those who, and this is perhaps why, maybe we go with the reasons why they should be refused. And the first one in verse 11 is they fill their passions. They begin to fill their passions. And you look at verse 11 and you look at verse 12, and they fill their passions not with godly things. They begin to fill their passions with ungodly things. They draw them, their passions, draw them away from Christ. You see that? And in verse 12, and so incur condemnation, having abandoned their former life. Now, it seems obviously that you can have passions, you can have desires in this world that aren't going to draw you away from Christ. But it seems in this context, we're talking about here specifically, if you continue in verse 11, their passions draw them away from Christ. They desire to marry. That specifically mentioned that they desire to marry. So it would seem that what particular desire that we are talking about is a carnal desire, a fleshly desire, perhaps even a sexual desire that is going to draw them away from Christ, so that their attention or their fidelity is divided. Instead of being solely devoted to God, solely focused on God, now their attention is divided. And we go other places. And they begin this desire to fulfill their perhaps even sexual passions. And maybe even they'll marry. And we can take that a step further. Maybe they'll even marry somebody that's not a Christian. Because it would seem that if you would marry somebody that is a Christian, that person would help you get closer to Christ. But in this context, they are being drawn away from Christ. So it would seem that they are trying to fulfill this passion as they fill their passions, that they are filling it with things that draw them away from Christ rather than uh, putting people in their life that bring them closer to Christ. If we can take a step back from this passage, there is a red flag, a warning flashing on the page. It matters who you marry. If you don't take anything else away from today, young people, if you haven't married, old people, if you have married, it matters who you marry. You're going to spend the rest of your life with them. And it is a whole lot easier for that person to bring you away from Christ, to bring you down, than for you to bring them up. Now, that's literal. It's also metaphorical, isn't it? Be careful. If I could give a recommendation, marry a Christian. It's going to make life so much easier. Back to the text. They feel their passions, and they feel their passions why they should not be enrolled. They feel their passions with things that divide their attention away from God, ungodly, fulfilling their ungodly passions. But the second thing, if you continue in verse 13, is that they fill their time. And it's not, we all fill our time with something, right? We all have 24 hours in a day. We all have whatever that calculates into a week and whatever that calculates into a year. We've all got the same amount of time. But the question is, how are you using your time? And that's what the problem is here. They are filling their time with things that they ought not to be filling it with. In fact, he calls them idlers twice. They are idlers. Now, if you will humor me for just a moment, an idle mind is the devil's. It's the devil's. You have playground, workshop, whatever you want to fill it with. So when you are idle, the devil steps in. And that's what's going on here. The devil is assuming control because they are idle. Now you can imagine the reputation that the church would have if they are sponsoring, if you will, this program where these widows, these younger widows, they have all the time in the world, and what they are doing with their time is they're filling their time, and they're filling their time by being idle. We might call it being a meddler. They're just going about in everybody's business but their own. They're not being productive in the least. In fact, they're being destructive. Not only do they fill their time and their passions, but they also fill their mouths. They fill their mouths with things that they ought not to fill their mouths with. Look at it. Besides, they learn to be idlers, going about, verse 13, going about from house to house. And not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. They're filling their mouths with things that are terrible. If there is one thing that will rip a congregation of God's people apart faster than anything, it's gossip. It's half truths, half facts, and half lies. So if you have in your mind, think about this. If you have someone that is spreading half truths and they're going about, they've got all day, nothing but time to go about from house to house and to share the latest gossip, everything that's going on in the church and everybody else's lives, everybody but their own, of course. You can see the discord being sown quickly. So refuse to enroll these people. In fact, encourage them to marry and to bear children. Let me tell you, it's going to take up a lot of that idle time that you found yourself with. That's what they ought to do. That's what they ought to, or Paul encourages them to do. And he says this, instead of disunity, they ought to, in verse 14, they ought to be able to withstand Satan. Because in verse 14, so I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. In fact, Satan, that's what his name means, is slanderer. What we want is we want to be able to withstand Satan when he comes and when he tries to destroy the church. Therefore, we need to make sure that we are busy about doing good. And in verse 15, we have the hint that not only should they be able to withstand Satan, but they also ought to stay in the faith. Because some, after doing this, they have, as it says in verse 15, they've already strayed. You know what a stray dog is? Just wander about, going from house to house, wherever they can get some food, wherever they can get some attention, that's where they are. You don't need somebody like that. We don't need to be like a bunch of stray dogs. We need to be busy about doing what's good. So we arrive at the application, if you will, the application for you and I, because I'm not, and many of you, in fact, most of you are not widows. So in a practical sense, what is the church's responsibilities? What are our responsibilities in the broad sense? Because we get several of these actually as we look at this and we apply it to our life, we understand. And I think as if we combine a couple of these as we look at them, because we have in verse 13 and verse 14 that the church's responsibility is to maintain a good reputation in the community and also to remain pure. That's what the church needs to do. That's what the church ought to do. That's what the church was created to do. Verse 13 and verse 14, if you read it, they go about from house to house, being idlers, gossip, busybodies, saying what they should not. Why? Well, the church needs to stay free from that. They have a reputation that they need to maintain in the community in order to be that city set on a hill. And in verse 14, we need to give the adversary no occasion for slander. We need to remain pure. If we want to be the bride of Christ, if we want to be pure and unblemished and spotless in his sight, we need to be pure and unblemished and spotless in his sight. And that's an individual responsibility. It's a congregational responsibility. That's what we need to do. In verse 15 and 16, we have the responsibility to do good. It's our job. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened. And sometimes we like to think, let's put a period right there. You take care of your own family, take care of your own people, and don't let the church worry about your people because you're capable. But don't stop. So that the church may care for those who are truly widows. So you see that the church is supposed to be helping. The church is supposed to have a reputation for helping those who are in desperate need. That's what we need to be doing all the time. Besides being busy, besides filling our time with the godly things and giving Satan no chance to enter our mind and to play around. Now I understand. I understand maybe the majority of this lesson in one ear, out the other. But I hope that you understand that the crux of this is that we have a responsibility, don't we? We have a job to do. If you want, when you get to the age, you get to the point where you are dependent or more dependent on other people. If you want other people to help you, don't you think that you need to help them? If you want the church to be an active role, an active part in how you are cared for in your mature days, then don't you need to be helping in every way that you can? Now, again, landing back where we started, we live in a time, we live in an age where the government helps with so much of this. And I'm thankful. But the church needs to help. The church needs to do what it can. And let me back up. How can the church help if the church never knows? There's a two-way street here that needs to be identified. Church, listen to me. We need to be involved in life so that we know the need. Those who are in need, listen to me. You've got to tell your need. If you want help, tell your need so that the church can help. What we see found in this particular text fits perfectly with what we've been talking about. We need each other. That's what the church is for. God has created the church for that purpose, so that we can help, so that we can aid each other, so that we can help get each other to heaven. If you're not a part of God's church, there's no better place to be. If you need to be baptized and be added by God, be added to His church, why don't you do that? Or maybe you need to come back to His fold.